Okay, hello, and thank you for watching episode 32 of Dan O Says So. My guest this week is a filmmaker, and he and I first crossed paths in, I believe, '89 when he was doing Sold Out, his zine, which was a slicker piece of production and a nicer piece of work than you typically saw in your local record store. The same could be said of his current film. He is the filmmaker of Dope, Pavement, and Hookers, and I like this part, the real and imagined history of Detroit hardcore. So Otto Buj, thank you for doing this, sir.
Thanks for having me, Dan.
Absolutely.
One thing I also want to thank you. In 1989 or '88, you let me sleep on the floor of your house when I was in California. That was a really nice thing.
There was something decidedly flophouse about my joint.
Yeah, I think it seemed a bit transitional, but it wasn't. I'm a guest, so I don't say nothing.
I believe by then I already owed you. You gave us bigger type on the front cover of Sold Out than you gave the Chromax.
Yeah, those are happy times. Happy
there
times.
we go.
Yeah.
No, there was nothing better than getting to know people that way back then. I wonder in the younger, scene, which is very real, though I'm not in touch with it as I should be, whether that's still the lifestyle, whether people are still crashing in each other's space. And, I often wonder how similar it is to what we grew up with,
I think it's just to sort of not to take up time on that, but I think the times are different. Technology is sort of facilitates things, and I think people might not be compelled as to connect directly as much anymore as they
right.
used to, which is
probably right. So the second half of the movie's title, The Real and Imagined History of Detroit Hardcore, is just fantastic. It's very self-aware and very self-effacing. What inspired it?
Well, I think what it is what inspired it was a good part of the story where it was very difficult to find consensus in terms of on what happened back, almost 35, 40 years ago. And what's interesting is the film is also as much about, sort of the way memory works, the way sort of mythologizing works, the way many people can remember the same thing or imagine the same thing, all slightly differently. And I think what happens is in the film there, you get certain participants, some of them are a little more elastic with the truth, and it makes for great storytelling.
That might be the most diplomatic framing I've ever heard. Anyway, go on.
But a few of them are like in that way, and it's something that you have to sort of understand that, okay, when you hear that person tell something that way, the next person comes in with a bit more of a sober assessment of what happened at the same place at the same time. You get a sense that there's no real sort of collective kind of truth. I mean, we're just dealing with details at this point in time, but it goes to show that, okay, a lot of this is still people hang on to that period in their life with a lot of sort of, they still remember it in sort of widescreen and cinema scope in that, the way it was back then, but it wasn't really that way. When you talk to some people, it was probably a lot more fascinating in hindsight, not to say it wasn't fascinating to begin with, but that's just the nature of storytelling. That's the nature of, recollection. That's the nature of mythologizing, self-mythologizing. So the film has a bit of fun with that. And I put it in the title only because you can't walk away from seeing this film with a sort of, how would you say, absolute sort of fact. And the film actually deals with that fact that there isn't really even possible to get collective sort of consensus on some things that happen.
It was a brilliant move, and it attracted me to the film even before I realized, hey, I know this fucker. Like, there's an interesting thing. Like we're in the era in the 2020s suddenly where documentation and archiving of the 80s in particular has a really high premium on it. I mean, one of the more interesting things about interviewing Ian MacKay this year is that he has sort of become master archivist, and he's fiercely defensive of it as something that's crucial and important rather than something that's sentimental. I think your film is largely sentimental, but that makes it lovable.
But I think there's a sentimentality because there's a human element to the experience that a lot of these people share. It's part of growing up. It's part of like a part of their life where they still had one foot. There's still an element of innocence there, and they were kind of figuring it out as they were going along and learning the hard way. And that's why the film also doesn't deal with what happens on stage, but it happens a lot with what deals off stage, for better and for worse. The camaraderie, as well as the introduction of like drug use, the introduction of violence, the introduction of emotional issues, suicide in some case. So all these things are part of someone's coming of age. And I think, you know, the sentimentality there, it's not nostalgia. It's just sort of people looking back at, like, you know, it was a kind of a beautiful but a tough way to come of age for a lot of these kids, you know, and they kind of, you know, by the time they
came across as such.
What's that? So that
it came across exactly that way.
Yeah, and I think that's the important thing, because it's, the film also aims to be a little more universal, so that if you watch this movie and you don't really care or know about punk rock or hardcore punk or 80s, the 80s sort of you know, transition there, you can still watch it on a sort of human interest level and relate to it in some way about how it was maybe growing up at a certain point in time where everything was still so fluid and confusing, and you're kind of fumbling through it. That's what the scene was really about. I mean, these kids really, Detroit, like one of the participants told me off camera, was always like 30 days behind what was happening in the rest of the country. But what was at the same, you know, some kid would go out west, see a show at the Mabuhay or whatever, go to a skate park in LA, they come back home, tell all the kids about Detroit, and it'd be in Detroit 30 days later. But the thing is, what's happening is in Detroit, it kind of, it was a self-invented scene in that level in terms of what, in practical terms.
Well, it's funny. People might find it odd. You sort of, you refer to Detroit. Third person isn't the word I'm looking for, but in a sort of removed sense.
Yeah.
And for that reason, just real quick, I'm going to put a flashlight on your accent. You're not a Detroiter.
I'm not. I live 8 minutes away from Detroit. You know what I mean?
But go ahead and tell them where.
Windsor, Ontario, which is
pretty much, you know you're carrying the boot and the
a boot and the roof and whatever I carry.
Yeah,
I know. But Detroit, I mean, Windsor is effectively like the sort of the gun-free socialist suburb of Detroit, and that's all. But culturally, I mean, you know, I was born in Toronto, raised in Windsor, but formed in Detroit, just based upon my experience of being so involved with, you know, music there and growing up there. But one thing back to the title, though, the real imagined history is a very important part, because it just goes to show that we're not really necessarily looking at something authoritative. But the first part's also very important, Joe Pooker's and Pavement, because that's a direct quote from John Brandon in the film, and that points directly to the tendency of these kids as looking back, as sort of heightening the whole experience, as if it was like an escape from New York type scenario where punk rock was happening, right?
Right.
In some respects, it's true, but in some respects, it's a bit sort of a bit of puffery, and that's why right away there's that sensationalism in the title, which makes you sort of question the veracity of the title in some ways. That's just part of the strategy.
I'd like to get into your take on a lot of those ingredients that those guests or that those speakers are expanding on. Before I do that, the intro to the film is interesting, and perhaps unintentionally, it very much justifies that your movie, more than some, is absolutely an oral history.
Yes.
So for people who haven't seen it, why don't you tell them how? I mean, I'm talking the very opening of the film. Yeah, it's handled fascinatingly.
Well, the opening of the film, I mean, the actual film itself, I mean, it opens with the film was really born out of me finding almost at the time 35-year-old footage of the Freezer Theater. My brother was an old hardcore kid in 80, 81, 82, right there when it was all coming together. And he brought my parents' Super 8 camera once to a show, shot this footage, silent color footage, low light, not terribly great footage, but very interesting, almost like a cave painting. It's sort of cryptic in that way. It's kind of fascinating. And then he just forgot that he shot it. He went off to school, off to university, and he just put it away in some drawer. And after my mom died in 2015, I took it upon myself to start like sort of archiving our whole family history, old images and old home movies. And I got a bunch of home movie footage transferred, and I'm looking through my, the footage as it comes back, and up pops this footage that I've never seen before. And I'd seen all this home movie footage. I knew it inside out. I knew the gestures of aunts and uncles and everything. And suddenly I see this footage, and me being a sort of a kid who was steeped in hardcore in the 80s, mid 80s onward, I right away recognized people. I'd see, hey, there's Todd Swalla. Hey, there's Bill Danforth, skater. Hey, that's Brannon. That's Tesco. I said, holy crap. This is like footage from the freezer that was, for me, compelling, because there had been no motion picture footage of the Freezer Theater in Detroit. Their footage which came later, maybe a half a year later, but there was no sort of documented evidence of that venue from a standpoint of a time-based medium. And I kind of put it up online for a bit, just asking people around, hey, can somebody help sort of situate this in terms of when this and that. And a whole bunch of people came forth just based upon a YouTube posting.
Mhm.
This show happened here. This is, who played. These are people, in the crowd and you see. And I realized, okay, there's still a very strongly, tightly knit community around this film. Not
Mhm.
around this film, around the scene, Detroit scene. And then, so what happened is I just decided, probably within a year, so maybe I'll just try interviewing people, see what sort of information I can get about this. And I started talking to people, and I realized that right then and there is a sort of a fascinating sort of relationship that people have with that part of their past and that part of the evolution of Detroit punk, Detroit rock and roll. And it's a story that's never really been told, because let's talk about Midwest hardcore for a second. Let's talk about Detroit hardcore. What evidence is there other than a book that did a decent job, two books that did decent jobs? So first one being American Hardcore, which did a fine job in book form, did a dog shit job as far as the film goes.
I'm not a fan, so that was fine.
No, because they treated the Midwest totally like a flyover scene.
They also treated 1986 as the end of the world.
Yeah,
even though I'm in 81, 82 start listening, 83 start going to shows, kid. That still pissed me the fuck off.
So they did a terrible job, and of course that they had Sony was behind it, and this. So there's a bit of resent there. And then Tony Rettman put out that book in 2010, 2011, which did a good job as far as people starting to collect these stories and whatnot. But then once I started talking to people, I realized there's a lot more animation here when you talk to people in person, on camera, and there's a lot of elements that maybe Tony didn't even cover in the book that started coming forth. And then on top of that, there's a connection. I'm in Windsor, Ontario, literally less than 2 miles from where the Freezer Theater was, across the river. But Windsor, Ontario, which is a city that really has nothing much to be proud of, can be very proud of the fact that Detroit hardcore, in some respects, has its origins in Windsor, Ontario, with some shows that happened in early 81, in the summer of 81, with Minor Threat and earlier shows of the DOA. So there's a bit of that local history component there that's nobody knew about. Really, nobody knew about. Even in Detroit, they kind of took it for granted. And then the story starts building. You talk to a lot of people, and there's a lot of sort of personal connections that people have to the scene. There's things like the Board Youth kids and that band, and their sort of their arc and their their tragedy associated with them, and just and just the whole evolution and how quickly it happened. And Detroit's an interesting scene. I don't know how it is with California necessarily, but Detroit almost in some respects flared out as quickly as it flourished, the early Detroit scene, because what happened is by 82, late 82, a lot of those original people had moved on. Hardcore was just pretty much a means and a method for that point in their life, and they'd moved on. And then a new sort of rollover comes in with new people there, a lot of whom were there for the wrong reasons, and they bring a lot of negative elements into it. So Detroit really never had a sustainable scene in that way, but when it did happen, it was actually sort of really, I mean, in some respects resonant even now. And the fact that we're talking about it, the fact that some people still point to some of these bands and sort of efforts.
Well, it's interesting. Like you take a really well-financed documentary like that, a 4-hour outing that was on the Epix network.
Was that the Iggy Pop one?
Well, that's the one. Iggy Pop and Varvatos are behind it, which
I never watched that, I confess, but
I find it addicting. But like anything, it cherry picks, right?
Yeah.
And so when it's Detroit, it's Iggy, it's Wayne Kramer, it's it's people like this. And then when it starts talking bald-headed, scrape your knee hardcore, it diverts to Black Flag and to New York City. And that's a common path, but it makes your movie all the more valuable.
But it's also, thank you, but it's also like that whole issue of Detroit being nothing but, and I mentioned this with another interview I did with Damien. There's a lot of sacred cows in the history of Detroit rock and roll. For some reason, everybody's obsessed with Iggy Pop and Wayne Kramer and the MC5 and the Stooges. But as far as I'm concerned, why aren't a band like Negative Reproach and Brannon given the same regard as a band like the MC5? When if you go song for song, there's no question NA is a far better band, far more sort of, in some respects.
I was going to say, it could be argued that I have a religious devotion to all three at this point in my life. But I found the pre-80s stuff after the fact. I found it as an older man. You talk to a lot of the people that you're mentioning here, and it's an interesting thing. you know,
Yeah.
these others that you mentioned who were at times hilarious in there.
Yeah.
But Tesco V is in it. You talk to Brannon quite a bit. You
Yeah.
talk to a lot of lesser known figures. You touch repeatedly down with Ian MacKaye, I think almost as a narrative device, which at first made me scratch my head. Then I read a review that framed it really well, which was that when they touched down, it was kind of a Beatles moment or an evolutionary moment.
Yeah.
And they came through Detroit.
Yes.
I liked reading that. But rather than hearing from the people who were on the other side of the camera, may I ask you now about some of the same ingredients that you interviewed them about? Yeah.
Ask me that again. Let me sort of untangle your question.
Okay. Yeah. I can disappear in a word salad like nobody's business, my friend. I want to ask you about the people and places that you asked all these notables about. In other words, it's time to flip the camera on you. And I'll start with the Cass Corridor, which prior to watching that was a completely unknown commodity to me and will be alien to most people prior to making the investment in your film.
Okay. Yeah, the Cass Corridor is a part of Detroit, downtown. It's between right downtown Detroit and Wayne State University. Historically, the Cass Corridor has always been a sort of bohemian enclave, starting in the 50s with jazz and the beatniks and so forth. It's a very poor stretch of land. It's a very poor stretch of the city. In some respects, I would say the equivalent might be almost like in New York. You've got like the Bowery or Lower East Side, and I don't know what it is in LA, if it's like a Skid Row type thing. But historically, the Cass Corridor has always been a place where the student ghetto met the real ghetto, and it was very affordable. And as a result of that, the Cass Corridor, which is probably literally about a mile wide by about 3-4 miles long, an area. It's always been a very permissible space for people to be for an enclave for artistic sort of endeavors. So whether people are down there doing free jazz or whether they're doing for a while there, the MC5 were down there in the late 60s. And you had a lot of things like obviously performance art, poetry, because nobody would bother with you. I mean, the local sort of population was had more greater concerns. I mean, in terms of bothering with these sort of mostly white kids who are down here just making music and making doing odd nonsense. I mean, creative nonsense sort of things as far as they're concerned. It was a place that allowed it to happen because there was no oversight. There was nobody there. Certainly were no cops most of the time there. And there's certainly no neighbors complaining about it being too loud at 2 a.m. So it was a place that a lot of these things could happen and could flourish. The hardcore scene found its way down there in 81, only because up until that point, they were only playing bar shows, and most of their audiences were underage. And if they couldn't sneak in, they decided, okay, we got to find a place to do shows with these kids. And granted, they found a place down in the corridor that was effectively like an unlicensed, illegitimate venue, 4 walls and a floor and part of a ceiling, often no electricity. And these kids would kind of create a scene to cater to what they wanted to see. And that was, in that respect, is very synergistic between all the parties in the corridor, because these kids, anybody who went down to the Cass Corridor to see a hardcore show in late 81, early 82 was there because they wanted to be a part of something or build a community. And the corridor, back to your questions, historically, the corridor was the sort of place you could do that. It also kind of created a bit of, right away, there was but the fact that you were there and that you probably sacrificed some aspect of your comfortable life and well-being and safety to be there meant that you wanted to be there. So it was almost like a sort of an initiation. If you were, if you had enough balls to come down to Cass Corridor to see a hardcore show, then you were there, you're part of us, you're part of our crew, our family, and you're welcome. And so in that way, it was great because it kind of filtered out a lot of the tourists. Anybody who was there was determined. Corridor could make it happen only because there was no oversight. It was, in some respects, lawless, like an empty slate, open book. People come down there, do what the fuck they want, that sort of thing.
I think a lot of cities have an area like that. A lot of times that's where the punk rock or the DIY venue will find its home.
Yeah.
But at least to listen to the people who speak in the film, Cass Corridor sounds like a fucking DMZ.
It was, in some respects, I think some of the people heighten it a bit. That's why the title comes in dope hookers. As far as John Brannon's concerned, some of the other people, that's all there was down there, was just like dope hookers and pavement, drugs, crime, prostitution, and just tough hardness. It's just like a sort of shitty existence. but some people say, no, it wasn't really that. If you really wanted that, that was maybe a few blocks over or a half a mile south, and nobody ventured there anyways because they knew they wouldn't last and so forth. But the kids were close enough for it to capture their imagination. I mean, put it this way, they weren't at a VFW hall or a Moose Lodge up in Sterling Heights or some sort of vanilla
Right.
suburb, right?
That's pretty
That's
well
not,
illustrated. Okay,
that's
let's
not where
talk
the,
about, you know,
yeah.
you mentioned it a couple of times just real quickly, but let's give some detail on the Freezer Theater.
Yeah. Okay. Well, Freezer Theater was a venue that had been around as an entity since the mid late 70s. It was run by a group called the Dramatic Research Company of Detroit, which were a bunch of ex-hippies who ran experimental performance art space. And like any ex-hippies, they kind of give everybody the benefit of the doubt, and they believe in, you know, human goodness and whatnot. So they'd done some like Rock Against Racism, had a bit of a franchise in Detroit that did shows there in the very early 80s. I think the Subhumans, the Canadian Subhumans played there in 1980, did a Rock Against Racism. DOA did a show in not in the quarter, but nearby. So there was a bit of music going on there, but what happened was, I believe Corey Rusk, Larissa, and John Brannon approached the people at the Freezer, these benign hippies, nice people, good people, you know, and I said, hey, we want to put on some shows here. And they're like, sure, do what you want. Here's the key, right? Lock up when you're done, right? You know, and they did it. They started doing it, and it just became this place that was sort of self-managing or self policing and whatnot. And it was like a raw space too. So first, like there's this great story in the film, like Todd Swallis, the first time they played there was no stage. There's a bunch of plywood and a bunch of pallets. Right. You can't play drums on plywood and pallets because everything's fucking moving and right. You know, people are falling through the stage. So what happens is then the kids sort of get together. Someone brings a pile of wood, someone brings some tools, someone brings a saw, they build a stage. And so they sort of built this little venue and this little community that was, and keep in mind, I mean, in a lot of places, and it's certainly Detroit, punk rock very often happens in licensed establishments, right? Legitimate establishments, right? And that's why some people try to make the comparison that, hey, what happened? Because even like in the 90s, the whole garage rock thing happened down in the Cass Corridor. And people say, isn't there a comparison there? I said, well, no, not really, because they happened at places that were liquor serving establishments that were sort of
venues with licenses and liability insurance.
Yeah, licenses, liabilities, all this and that. As far as the Freezer goes, none of that existed. They didn't have power for the last half of the life of the Freezer, so they brought in power from the neighboring pizza shop, you know, with extension cords. And it was just a great place. And a couple of big shows happened there. You know, the Minor Threat was the end show where it just turned into this epic sort of brawl, and the place got shuttered after that. But before then, the Misfits came in, did a massive show there in a place that literally is like 1,500 square feet, packing 400 kids in there. So it's just like, there's a lot of sort of like a lot of sort of legendary sort of, you know, spontaneous things that did happen there, but it happened all by the effort and the handiwork of all the kids who were there and involved. Like everybody who was there had some stake in what was going on.
All right. And what was its eventual undoing? I mean, besides the Minor Threat show, wasn't there an attempt at a secondary venue? Or
well, there wasn't. There's a venue up the street, like probably 2 or 3 blocks north of the Freezer. Was a space that John, Brandon, and Larissa had where they rehearsed for NA and L7. And what happened was after the Freezer shuttered, they moved up the street and did some shows there through the end of '82. But that was also another illegitimate space. But by then what happened was it was starting to catch on. So you started getting a lot of the skinhead element. You started getting a lot of, you know, people being stupid with booze and walking in and out of the place with big 40s and stuff. And so that started drawing attention to it by virtue of cops and neighbors dealing with, like, you know, and so then that after that, it was kind of the end. It was the end of the first evolutionary sort of phase of Detroit hardcore. And then it just became a scene of club shows and hall shows.
Well, your personalities were well chosen. The segments are well timed. As something that's not drowning in a sea of grainy VHS footage, but a ton of archival flyering and fantastic photography, it moves along very nicely. I recommend to everybody that they do the work, go to the site and watch it. And I would like to end this interview later, a few minutes from now, with you giving as much information about how to do so as possible.
Absolutely.
But now let's talk a little bit of philosophy.
Sure.
When we were kids, I remember the only hardcore movie or punk rock movie I had on tape You know, I'm not going to say the decline or something like that, because it's
Yeah.
more like, I was more like studded belt punk rock. And I'm talking about as things started to evolve into 81, 82, 83, right?
Yeah.
The only thing I had that was in actual movie format was Another State of Mind, you
Yes.
know, the BYO doc, right?
Yes.
And
Yes.
fast forward 30, maybe closer to 40 years,
Yes.
hardcore docs are not that rare a beast.
No. And
A doc like yours about Detroit, absolutely. But hardcore docs in general, first off, where do you think that appetite comes from? And do you see it as important?
Well, I think what it is that I mean, documentation in itself is important. You know, accurate documentation is even more important. I think it's a sort of everything. Almost hardcore documentaries are almost exclusively going to be niche and localized in terms of interest, right?
Mm-hmm.
Here's a documentary on the Minneapolis scene. There's a documentary on the Austin scene. You know, there's a documentary on the tough New York scene. You know, this sort of thing. So they all have these sort of niche, sort of like areas of interest. I'm no different in that respect. I mean, I'm handling obviously a Detroit Midwest hardcore scene. What might be a little different from what I'm doing is that the Midwest has never been regarded as being a sort of a relevant scene nationally.
Mm-hmm.
Like Ian says in the film, it might not have been a sort of a major scene, but it was a very much an energy center that the rest of the country could connect with, because knowing that there was an audience there and there's an energy there. So I think, but back to your question with the philosophy, I think right now a lot of this information, like, and that's where the film starts with this old home movie footage, amongst which I found the freezer footage. Was we tend to forget, and this is something very obvious, that we are talking something that's nearing ancient history, literally, because in the film, Rob Michaels, board youth singer, great guy, great articulate man, says something very interesting, very poignant. He says, when they were doing what they were doing in 1980, 81, down in the Cass Corridor, down in the Freezer Theater with Midwest Hardcore, they were only 12 years on from the Summer of Love. Keep that in mind, 12 years on.
Right.
And we are now talking about something 40 years on.
Right.
So you get a sense of like, wow, this is all belongs to the distant past. But in some respects, that distant past still feels incredibly modern and relevant and resonant today in terms of its influence. The DIY, I mean, obviously the music and whatever, you know, what it all led to, with things that are now just big and normal for most people. Well, how much this was a part of it.
Well, I've got a counterpoint for you, which occurred to me while you were talking, and that is, you remember when it was the big debate, and I'm talking, this is maybe 6 years after the Sex Pistols. There's already this raging debate in the underground community whether or not punk was dead.
Yeah.
There's always this obsession with when we could put the RIP on it, right?
Yeah.
Well, the fact that the earliest stages of hardcore punk, there's now an obsessive documentation of it going on, and the fact that there is always new music, and the fact that a lot of the newest punk rock and hardcore is influenced by the oldest punk rock and hardcore, I think maybe serves to validate this as a genre alongside blues, jazz, rock and roll, as something that's not supposed to have a shelf life. It can have an evolution and it can have a golden age, but I don't think it's temporary.
No, I think one thing is, keep in mind when people talk about punk being dead back in the early 80s, or they're talking about punk as a sort of a major label sort of construct, a media construct. Okay, once EMI lost interest, once Polydor lost interest in these bands, suddenly these bands didn't matter anymore. They didn't exist. No, but these bands started something. It just demonstrated something that people picked up on and continued. But what I think is interesting about hardcore, and I say this sort of bittersweet in a way, is that you have to understand, and I feel embarrassed even mentioning to you this, is because you're in a band and whatnot, you were and are, is that it's a transitional sort of genre of music for a lot of people who are involved. It's something you come into, you do to its maximum, you sort of establish the mold, and then you move on, you outgrow. It's by nature something that needs to be outgrown as you move on to other things. That is my take on hardcore. Sort of, it's essentially something that has to run its course for the individual.
I think if you keep repeating the same hardcore, and if you keep creating something that is clearly identifiable as being in sync with your, you know, junior and senior year of high school, your first 2 years of college, you're doing something that's toxic and that's a book report on a life you're not living now. On the other hand, to create music that is constantly evolving, to challenge yourself on subject matter, and to find relevance. If you're a middle-aged man, sing about middle-aged life. If you're a divorcee, sing about loneliness and rejection. Then you're still doing something vital and something crucial that is painfully rare.
Yep. But I think at that time, that's why I understand, like, in some respects in 81, 82, 83, I understand why the Negative Approach became the Laughing Hyenas, why the Necros became Aerosmith, why Black Flag became whatever, you understand, because they kind of have sort of, they've kind of expressed all they can within the parameters of what they started out doing. In retrospect, I think, though, what they started out doing is fascinating and is what sort of resonates still today. Music's not been a big part of my life for the last 20, 25 years, but it's always been a part of my life, but not a big part of life. But even now, I listen to a lot of this music that at the time, I thought I outgrew and left behind by the time I turned 20. And I listen to it now, and it's still great rock and roll.
Yeah.
With a different skill set, maybe in a different set of circumstances, is still a great rock and roll. And that's the one thing people have to understand it as. Revolutionary in the fact that nobody sort of allowed you to do it. You did it, sort of on your own terms. But that's the thing, is in respect. But back to hardcore as a form, as a genre, I think it's great that it continues. It's new for somebody always, and there's always people who are making it a little more challenging for themselves and whatnot. The fact that some of the people who at the time decided not to continue making it challenging for themselves is okay too. And that's the thing, I think, that,
varying degrees.
What's that?
To varying degrees.
To varying degrees. And I think, but now it is, like you were saying, it is alongside blues, jazz, hip hop, rap, rock. It's just a genre now. It's a market. It's a commodity form. And it's just, and that's where it's become. And I think it's lost a bit of its sort of, in that respect, it's revolutionary kind of quality, its wildness.
I have this theory that the most revolutionary spaces in this music would probably efficiently evade the radars of a couple of middle-aged men sitting around doing a nighttime Zoom. That there could be. I'm certain there's a world out there flying this flag that far exceeds my understanding.
There is, and one thing, I'll just wrap up my part by saying, I'm controlling the streaming on my film right now, because in lieu of distribution and with the pandemic and whatnot, it's the only really way to do it. But I look at who watches this film and where they watch it. It's fascinating, the fact that I'm dealing with people in Australia and Brazil, in Japan and Moscow and in Sweden, and places that it must mean something to these people. And I could never underestimate that, even though I might be a little exhausted by it, or tired, or a little sort of worn down, or disinterested in some level. It's still something eye-opening and revolutionary for some people to encounter it. And I think that's beautiful. That's great.
I think it's true. Yeah. Let's do that. This is a little bit short. It's satisfying to me. I got one subject I want to touch on, and then I want to get to the issue of distribution and how to view the film.
Yes.
We sort of touched on this a little bit already.
Yeah.
But there's always been a coastal preoccupation in the nation's understanding of hardcore punk rock.
Yes.
And it either lands in Los Angeles around Black Flag and the Circle Jerks, and then whatever, and the Descendants, and whatever happened for the following 10 years, or it deifies what went on in New York in this sort of Bowery rough kid image, a lot of which is valid, and a lot of which is birthed in a legendary venue.
Yeah.
But it's bizarre, and I think the advantage to film and the popularity of these documentaries it's bizarre that Chicago doesn't get its day in court, that Detroit doesn't get its day in court. You refer to Brandon several times during this interview. Everybody watching this interview is going to know who you're talking about.
Yeah.
Yet it almost seems like these personalities raised, but these Midwest cities did not.
I think, the coastal preoccupation has to do, I think, on some level with the fact that LA, California, maybe not. San Francisco was also a major scene at that time.
Definitely.
Yeah. But LA and New York, they're also major sort of media markets. So there's always going to be like A&R people floating around and looking at things and noticing things. Washington is, if you want to talk about organic scenes, I can never consider, in some respects, New York, I hate to say maybe LA, as organic as Washington, D.C. was or Detroit was. Because I think what happened was in LA, you still had, there was a infrastructure there for bands to sort of perform, develop, find an audience, whether it's the whiskey or whatever the clubs are.
Well, it's such a populous era that things existed on more than one level.
Yeah, I mean, but there was even a venue for even the most oddball outlier type thing. There was a venue for that. In Detroit, there weren't venues. I mean, I can't talk about Chicago, but even in like DC, there weren't venues for the Discord bands. They did Madame Zorgan and then whatever hall shows they put together. But that's the interesting thing. The preoccupation in New York is a whole sort of scene where there also was an infrastructure of spaces where these bands can play. I mean, I don't know who did hall shows in New York. Nobody does hall shows in New York, right? Probably, right?
Right. No. Yeah. I in my head, there's this progression of Max's Kansas City, CBGB's,
exact Mud Club,
and then by the time it was Hoodie Core, people would make the train commute out to the Anthrax and things like that.
And that's the thing, yeah. So I think what it is, but to answer your question, is what those flyover states, Michigan, Chicago, Illinois, not so much Cleveland or anything, but even in some respects, DC, these places, the people had to create the scene to be able to indulge in it. They had to be participants to actually sort of to watch, to be spectators, to be witnesses. You have to be a witness and a participant, and that was, I think, but that's sort of, it's a lot of hard work, but it's not terribly sexy and it's not very telegenic from a standpoint of the media or coverage concern. And that's why, I mean, you look at Chicago. I mean, Chicago's had a few great bands, Articles of Faith, Effigy's fantastic band, but they were not in a city associated with, rock and roll, with culture, the production of culture. So I think that's maybe one of the things, and it's no less like applicable to punk than it is to other forms of maybe music. You got to be the places where there's the most eyes on you to see, before you get noticed. And I think hardcore is probably also not, but it's a little different now with internet, and obviously, I mean, talk about internet, but with interconnectivity, is that all eyes are everywhere. So, and that is something that's a little easier now. But I think hopefully that makes sense.
It made sense.
Yeah.
So 800-foot gorilla for a guy who dropped a film within the last year. You had to drop your movie. You had to drop your movie during the pandemic.
Yeah.
Challenges.
Yeah. Well, do you want me to just say what I gotta say? I gotta say this. It's a mixed blessing because the film was supposed to come out in April. Launch at Detroit's got a big daily. The Daily Papers has an annual festival, documentary festival. It was going to launch there in April. Third Man was going to put out a soundtrack. All that went in the toilet with the virus.
Right.
And I decided that, I was supposed to do a road show with it. I was supposed to go to Brooklyn, to DC, to Pittsburgh, to Toronto. All that, obviously didn't happen. And I thought that, okay, I could sit around indefinitely and wait for an opportunity to go live with this, but that can still happen, because I think once the film is out, maybe people have ingested it. It might become something they might be more interested in revisiting with an accompaniment of guests and this and that. But I had to self-distribute at this point in time, and that's something that is just a reality, I think, with filmmakers, because there's no tangible venues right now.
No.
So I elected to control it through using a streaming service. Eventually, it might get dumped onto the Amazon Prime, the Hulu, the Google Play. But I think once you get to that point, it's like pissing into the ocean. You're like, who's going to find you, right?
I don't know. There's a lot of geeks like me, a lot of self-medicating old fools on the couch who watch late night music documentaries ad infinitum. Yeah. Don't underestimate us as a market, sir.
Well, I think in 6 months I'll see you in that sort of, we'll see.
Amazon Prime is the first place I looked for it before you and I were talking. I was aware of the film before you and I got this back and forth going.
Yeah, I think but the other thing is this, purely, if for all the filmmakers out there, people who want to make films, I think what happened is self-streaming. It's hard to find your audience. I'm doing decently, granted. I'm not doing bad by no means. But the problem is I control the revenue at this point in time, which is very important. If I hand it over to someone like an Amazon Prime or Google Play, you get residual checks. You don't know. You have no control over it anymore. And
there's a weird perversion to everything that we've just talked about for the last half hour. Ending up going through the tunnel of Bezos anyway, but Yeah. Well, listen, why don't you
Yeah.
give the actual hard details on how to,
Okay. If
I
you
don't
want to
mean
see
as
the,
in difficult, but as in concrete
yeah,
details on how to watch the film.
if you want to see the film right now, it's very easy. You know, the couple of thousand people have already done this. So yeah. www.detroithardcoremovie.com. Go there. Right at the top of the webpage, there's a button there says watch it now, buy a ticket. Right now it's $10. Eventually it's going to go down a bit. You click that, it takes you to a streaming service. If you're tech savvy, you connect your computer to your TV with an HDMI cable. You could sit back, like you're saying, put your feet up and watch it on a big screen TV. If not, you can watch it on your desktop or laptop or whatever. But www.detroithardcoremovie.com, and then we take care of business from that point forward.
I watched it on my full-size TV, and sir, I find combining cereal and milk complicated. So it's an easy thing to do. Well, listen, anything else you want to make sure you touch on before we move on, sir?
Yeah, I think, you know what, there's so much there. There's a lot to talk about. I think for me, it's something that, you know, someone said, you know, reached out to me, Mike Gitter. I knew him very, you know, incidentally back in the day.
I talked to him last night.
Last night, he said something very, he said, good to hear from you again. I haven't heard from him. I took pictures of his band back in the late 80s when they played CBs. And he was saying, it's just weird how now there's so much of these people from that era are coming forth with like books, movies, music in some cases. And I just said, you know what? It's because it's probably in some ways, it was probably the last, you know, great piece of evidence of a scene being created from very little for its own sake, for its own needs. I mean, if you think even people talk about early hip hop and this and that, that's fine too. But that also immediately almost had an industrial sort of involvement from in terms of the media complex involvement with that. Hardcore punk 80s, and like Ian says this in the film, it took them almost 10 years before the major labels really took it seriously. You know, before they started like really signing bands and putting any sort of.
And when they did, it didn't last.
No, it didn't last, and whatnot. And some people argue that, okay, hey, all this led to Nirvana or something like that, which is kind of true, and you know, in some respects.
Except that, well, the thing, no, see, when nobody, I take exception with that, not with your statement or with their statement.
Yeah.
But the context is off. People don't understand that Nirvana was plucked from this space. Those are punk rock kids.
Our space here. Yeah.
They weren't created as this entity that they became dubbed as.
No.
You know? I mean, when I first saw I saw him in a Long Beach bar called Bogarts, and I think Tad played over him, and Billy Rubin's band opened. You know, and Billy Rubin's a shaven-headed, you know, camo-wearing, chaos-minded little punk rocker. It wasn't this separate entity that retroactively it's been dubbed as this separate evolution, and it wasn't.
No, it's not.
It was a localized punk scene with particular sound,
which got exploited by sort of like, you know, label interests and that sort of. But the point I was making is that people tend to forget the resonance of this that early scene today. I mean, I was telling someone, a very straight-laced sort of dude who has no relationship with punk rock at all, as a musician, but he doesn't know shit. And it says, you know, you have to think, you know, you talk about, like we talk about Nirvana, you even talk about a band like Metallica, how much of an influence punk rock was on that band early on. Absolutely. And how it pushed them to a certain sort of form of expression. And then you go later, you get the Green Days, of course, and then you get the Rage Against the Machines, and of course, then you get like the White Stripes thing, and all this has this element of 80s punk, American hardcore punk in it, but American hardcore punk was not something that was easily marketable at the time to be sort of developed. But eventually someone came along and said, okay, we're going to pick and choose some aspects of it, and we're going to create music that suddenly people are getting acclimatized to. We're going to speed things up a bit. We're going to let people go crazy on the dance floor now, and people are going to get accustomed to seeing that. And then more people get comfortable with it, and it gets bigger and this and that. But nobody ever really goes back to say, hey, how big of a part were the Circle Jerks or Black Flag a part of this?
A lot of people who are exposed to the current mutation are shocked when they're exposed to the source.
Yes, and the source for them is as alien as anything, but they just know the sort of the resonant influence. Right. And that's the thing, is that one thing is very important here. And I think, not that my film really is going to be a revelation to anybody, but it's going to point to the fact that, hey, there were things happening either while you were sleeping or before you were born that really kind of made it a lot easier for people 10, 15, 20 years down the line. A lot easier. And that's, I think, one of the things I want to say. We're preaching the converted because we're both, you know, sort of
old punk farts.
Yeah, but you know what? But for someone's going to hear this for the first time and think about that. I said, yeah, something did happen between the Ramones and Nirvana.
I think one of the reasons that I watch documentaries ad infinitum now, and I watch endless hours of footage, is I'm trying to understand my own youth. I understand the roots of it better now than I did while it was happening.
Yeah, when you're in the throes and the sort of the heat of it, you just don't understand like where this is going or why we're doing what we're doing and whatnot. Right. And that's the sort of fascinating thing. And I think the Detroit kids, that's what I deal with in that way. These kids weren't aware that they were setting a template. They had no clue about that at all. You know, even something as simple as Tesco Lead putting out Touch and Go, fanzine, label. He had no sort of foresight in terms of how this is going to be sort of, you know, linger forward.
He communicates that pretty well in the movie.
He does.
I'm going to go ahead and wrap this up here. Your voices were chosen very well and laid out very well, as were the contrasts between their perspectives.
Yeah.
At times, people are very real about things, about tragic events,
about
violent events. It sort of comes out, you know, there's no polish on the nails in your doc, and I commend you for that. There's also no false heroism. Other than that, what you identify right there in the title.
And there was something else. There's something else I want to add, Dan. Yeah. There's also, I didn't want to self-censure because the film indulges with a lot of humor that might be a little too raw or insensitive for, you know, today's sort of climate, political climate, social climate. But I let these people talk. You know, if Tesco wants to talk about tooling for anus, let him talk about tooling for anus. We're not going to apologize for it, but it will be challenged on camera. You know what I mean? Like,
if you were to represent the behavior of the 80s as filtered through the norms of the 2020s, you'd be creating a false document.
Yeah, you would, absolutely. And people are always, you know, if they can't handle that, you know, they can change the channel. Of course, that's that. But you can't hide that sort of that. You can't hide the documentation of the sensibilities and judgments of youths from that point in time, because it wasn't necessarily malicious or sort of harmful. It was just maybe a little insensitive or a little sort of immature, but it wasn't sort of in some ways it wasn't hurt, you know, and sorry, what's the word, it wasn't really malignant in that way. It was just
agreed.
Yeah, and that's the thing. But the film lets people not have to apologize for that.
It's a warts and all talk, which is why I was happy to do this episode. That's why I loved when you and I got to talking about it. Well, listen, that is episode 32. Otto Buj, thank you a ton, sir.
Thank you, Dan O'Mahony.